biography there, Andrew, about your first introduction to complementary therapists as helping a young girl in an Indian airport who was saved through reflexology.
Yeah.
Quite an amazing story, that one. I really like that one.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
it was quite something. Um there was a guy who was from northeast India, and he'd gone to America to train as a missionary. Um and and then he was coming back through Delhi to fly back home. And this is one of the things that they taught him,
Really?
was reflexology, because it's really big in America. That's where it started off with
Yeah,
Unison. And so yeah, there I am in the airport, and she had this huge asthma attack, and her whole face was just going blue. Her lips were going cyanose, blue,
yeah,
and she was terrified and screaming to start off with, and then just kind of got more and more passive. And I was working in the mining industry at the time, so
yeah,
if you're in the coal board working underground, in any sort of management job, then we were trained more or less to paramedic level.
yeah,
So I went along and did the usual first aid,
yeah.
and her lungs started moving, but her lips were just going bluer and bluer. And then this guy came along, took her shoes off, and twiddled her feet, and I just saw this flood of blood come back to her face. It was amazing.
Incredible.
So
Yeah,
that was how I got interested in all of this.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And Yeah.
Great story.
Sort
Very
of, I
good.
won't say I've never looked back, but certainly, yeah, look forward quite a lot. Yeah, it's been
Great.
great.
All right. So what are we going to be covering tonight then, Andrew?
Okay, so this is kind of a little sort of snippet. When I'd been practicing cranial work for about 10 years, so this is maybe 20 years ago now,
Hmm.
I started to realize a lot of people coming in with physical problems. Actually, it was an embodiment issue, um, and um, and Norwich is um, was the home of the UK Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation at the time, because of certain senior psychiatrists and psychologists who lived there. So I was quite lucky, really, and there was a conference at UEA that I went to. Um, and I'm actually presenting, I won't say I'm presenting data from that conference.
Yeah.
That would be an exaggeration, but I'm presenting an idea from that conference 20 years ago, which I actually
Hmm.
followed up. Um, so this has kind of been a theme in my work, or part of my work ever since, is and also how I kind of see a lot of things in the world. There are a lot of reasons why there's illness and so on, and a lot of it goes back to trauma and overwhelm that's invisible because it's systemic. So I'm just going to talk around that whole topic, um, and um, and I don't want to make it really heavy by just going, this is what's going wrong, this is what's going wrong. I could do, but it's not particularly useful for people listening who don't know much about it. So I'm going to keep it more positive by going, well, okay, put some things in as well. What can we do about this?
Yeah. We,
It's yeah, really important to keep a balance when looking at this stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
We had a lovely webinar a couple of weeks ago on adverse child events.
Mm.
And that was very positive as well, actually.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's so important to do that,
Mhm.
to maintain that. What can we do, rather than, because part of the issue with the endemic trauma and whatever that we have in the general population is there's too much information, and a lot of it's really negative,
Yeah.
and it leaves a sense of hopelessness. And what can we do? And so that is part of the issue. So it's not a good idea to try to address it by just adding
Mm.
to that whole here's more information and there's nothing we can do. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was one of the issues that was brought up with the with the ACE study around, your likelihood if you've had, several of these kind of events, that then you're more likely to, get a heart attack, or all these very, very, very negative things.
Yes.
Most people will have had at least 4 of these events happening to them. So if you get into
Yes.
your mind, my gosh, I'm more likely to die or more likely to suffer, it's not very helpful. And also the questionnaires are apparently, associated that people get to be very blunt and brutal, really. So
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yes, and it can be a bit in your face.
yeah,
So it's important to have that outlook. It's not just here's something that needs addressing. It's like, well, how can we address it?
yeah,
And there's a lot of work being done on this, being done on this, all over the world. There's some really amazing things being done in America at the moment.
yeah,
A lot of the There's a lot of Native American academics and people in the therapy world who've got together and actually putting together some um, positive programs. They're kind of changing they put together a kind of an altered view of the of neurology, which is kind of more based on their cultural experience of what works. So there's some really interesting things happening. So this is a very small kind of area that needs unpackaging, and so I've got this. We've booked with eHealth Learning this series in a few weeks, aren't we? So I'm going to do that in a bit more
yeah.
detail, and we'll have more practical on that, so that which is again really important. It's
Yeah.
the practicality. Yeah.
Very good. All right. So you got a few slides, I think, haven't you, Andrew? Is that right?
Yep, and we'll go through, and then there'll be time for questions at the end, and take it from there. Yeah.
Very good. Alrighty. So do you want to share your?
Okay. Yep. Um, so if I go to screen share, whoops, there we go. Okay.
Wonderful.
Right then. So okay, so there's a lot of dissociation in our culture, and I put this Western techno-scientific culture, which kind of the whole there's a lot of things in our culture that tend to create um, trauma and dissociation, and there are technical definitions of trauma and dissociation, which are used in psychiatry, and I don't deal mainly. I deal with a few severe cases, but over the last 20 years, I've dealt with quite a variety of cases. But obviously, I don't see the more extreme ones because they end up, needing specialist care. So there's a spectrum. Everyone talks about trauma with big T as if it's one thing, and if it's always big. And actually, it's just like someone having a cold. It can be anything from full-blown influenza down to a little sniffle, dribble, which is a little bit annoying and nothing else. And this is exactly the same. So the definition of trauma that I've ended up kind of gravitating towards is actually it's overwhelm. So it's a state of overwhelm that has never been renormalized. And it's never been renormalized because the nervous system that's still carrying on that as if it's still happening has never been recalibrated with the present reality. And so this is one of the things in our culture which is the main problem. We make that quite difficult. Okay, so if I somehow get that to, okay, define the situation. So if you gave the whole UK population an instrument is a questionnaire that's used to work out where someone is psychologically or in their lifestyle or whatever. So if you did one that measured clinical levels of trauma and dissociation, then you would find that about between 10 and 20% of people in the UK population had clinically measurable levels of PTSD or dissociation, and about somewhere between 0.1% and 1% would register as having complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or something called dissociative identity disorder, which is a fragmentation of the personality. It's really quite severe. So those numbers are actually really quite high. And then if you go to a non-peaceful country, you go across to Israel, and the numbers are a lot higher. Now, this is a major societal issue, because anyone who is walking around with that condition is less able to objectively judge the state of the world around them, or the intent of the people around them, and it's harder to have trust. There's a whole load of knock-on effects. Now, clinically measurable means that it's above a certain threshold, because if you're, it's just like it's exactly like the cold. You wouldn't take someone into hospital who just had a little dribble from their nose, but clearly there's a point at which you go, yeah, this person needs hospitalizing because they've got COPD or something. So there's certain degrees of severity, and there's a cutoff, because below that cutoff, then the instrument that measures this ceases to be accurate, and it could pick up any old noise. So what it means is, because of that threshold and the difficulty in diagnosing, there's actually that 20, not 10 to 20% and 0.1 to 1% is actually a massive underestimate of the amount of that's out there. So to show that on a graph, so the orange bits would be the people who were diagnosed, and then actually the people who still have that but they're below the threshold could go back. Well, it could be the whole lot. I mean, having looked at this, for 20 years, I kind of I don't think I've met many fully embodied people. And if somebody is not fully embodied, that means that there is a certain part of their system is still in overwhelm. And there's I've met a handful in my whole life of people who are fully embodied, literally. And of course, with some, it's, with most people who are walking around with this, they don't notice, because the thing about overwhelm is that it creates more of a numb, blank, absent sort of quality, which normalizes very quickly. So then there's just a sort of an absence, which you can't notice at all, except when somebody, say, goes on a meditation retreat for a week, and then they suddenly realize halfway through it that the colors are suddenly brighter, or the sounds are clearer. And what's happened is that they've settled down into their nervous system, and then that something has switched back on that had switched off, that they never knew was switched off before. So this is quite a common experience with and what's happening is it's kind of revealing this. Okay, so and this was all defined over 20 years now by Robert Scare, maybe an appropriate name. His book is not very thick, but about 50% of it is references in very small print. So he did an incredibly detailed, documented search of all of the medical research, and he demonstrated pretty clearly that almost every single illness, whether it's physical or mental, that we have in our society could potentially because purely by people having some low level or high level undiagnosed PTSD or dissociation of some sort. And um, um, and now this is certainly what I see in my bodywork practice. And it's been normalized so much, you know, that this a lot of things that we see around us in what are considered normal behavior, actually they're not. And you know, Krishnamurti said this: it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society, and that's the position that we're in now. So where have we come from? Because if this is not the norm, then you know, what is the norm, and how is our nervous system set up to deal with the world? Um, Now, you know, humans and every other single living creature now has survived several of those, um, and come out the other side. And what that means is that actually, from a genetic point of view and a biological point of view, there is this vast, utterly vast amount of adaptive capacity and resilience in everything that's living, because this is what it's come through. Okay. And when you're born, or even, you know, the egg that you that was fertilized, that then formed you, that is itself, when it's in the environment of the womb, is incredibly also resilient and has a huge adaptive capacity. And then that gradually gets eaten up through life. And the thing is that if you, as I said in the talk with John, if the focus is on purely what can go wrong, this actually takes us into more trouble. And if we all look inside, then actually there is this huge well of resilience, and it can really only be accessed when there's a slowing down. And the thing is that all of the activation and the dissociation tend to speed us up. So then it becomes invisible, but it's still there. I don't know if any of you have read Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. He really is the expert. He's totally the expert on this, because he went through the unimaginable, but he went into it with a whole set of tools. He worked as a clinical psychologist in the university hospital in Vienna, before he was sent to Auschwitz. And so you know, he had all of the tools at his disposal that he'd used to help other people, and then he wrote about that when he was released, and it was so urgent that he did it. He did that. He must have been skeletal when he was released, but within 7 or 8 weeks, he'd written that book, because it was so important for him to do that. And it's well worth a read, because you know, it's almost a handbook of resilience. So he describes, you know, a good sense of humor is a really important part of it. I'll come to this in a second. Okay, and again, you know, what have we gone through from an evolutionary point of view? So I'm putting this up there. You know, if you notice, like from 4.5 billion years ago or so, when the Earth was created, up to about 500 million years ago, most of that is cells working out how to survive, and how to survive well, and replicate themselves well, and how to work together to do that. So there's 4 billion years of evolution was setting up our basic biochemistry. And so, if you look at a cell's biochemistry, then it's actually repeated in the biochemistry of larger organisms and complex ones like us, because it's had 4 billion years of refinement, and the result is this is what works and other stuff doesn't. So that's what we have. And then everything else is sort of minor tweaks and modifications and adaptations. And then you get to the last 500 million years, which is when sort of higher creatures like slugs and then vertebrates came along. And again, there's a kind of a basic sort of body plan. There's a 3 compartment body plan that you'll see in dragonflies and pretty well everything else that's any size at all. And that includes that actually includes the basic autonomic nervous system that we have, and it's all in that body plan. So again, there was this evolution much faster once you had the basic biochemistry. Then you get the body plan with all the neurology set up, and by 500 million years ago, that was sorted out. So then you get the higher animals, including us, and you see those little triangles there. They're the big extinctions that happened. And there was a little bit of a bloop, but there we go, 150 million years ago, when mammals had started to be around. Then that's when biodiversity really started to kick off. Flowering plants had sort of formed themselves. And you can see that last little triangle there. That's the KT one that the picture that I showed you, and it's this tiny little hiccup of biodiversity. So that gives you a sense of the resilience that's inbuilt into everything that's alive today, and our culture's kind of getting in the way of that, but we still have it. Okay. Right. So probably the most important parts of the nervous system, given that basic body plan that you get in a dragonfly, we developed a pelvis. That's kind of like it's a relatively minor add-on. It does some extra things, but it's still a little bit of an add-on. And then the last 2 million years or so, maybe million years, have formed the human nervous system. And most of that was formed when we were hunter-gatherers wandering around in a relatively unpopulated Earth. So there's an American academic anthropologist called Darcy and Narvaez, who the title of her book has just kind of blown out of my head. It'll come back in a second. But basically, she's looked at this and Native American cultures and gone, okay, this is what actually formed the human nervous system. And there's a nice quote on the right there from David Woolgate, a herbalist who went around various indigenous cultures interviewing people, sort of wanting to find out what herbs they used. So I asked in Siberia, what happens if you get ill? The guy was very, very confused. Well, and then worked out what was being asked. And he says, well, we don't get ill. That's a really interesting comment, isn't it? We don't get ill. People get injured sometimes, but if you are getting plenty of exercise, which you do if you're living outdoors all the time, they interact with a strong community. So this is the thing that Darcy Narvaez has pointed out. If you get a hunter-gatherer community or an indigenous community, the children grow up fully integrated, and they don't just have a pair of parents, the whole community are their parents. If they're going to learn something, it's the person who's the best at that will teach them. They are nourished and nurtured and allowed to run totally wild. And the environment that they're in is maybe it's dangerous, but also it's full of everything that they need in order to not just survive but thrive. Okay, which demands a certain quality of attention, and it's this quality of attention actually which then tells your nervous system that the world you're in is safe enough. Not totally safe, because there's no such thing as 100% safe, but that it's safe enough. And the other thing is the nutritious diet without added junk. So again, people who are living in the wild, there's a really interesting little archaeological discovery in Scotland. They found a loch dwelling. So there was this sort of whole village on stilts. I guess it was more easily defended and whatever, in the middle of a loch, and someone had managed to burn it down. Whether it was someone attacking it or the residents just kind of were a little bit careless with the fire. But that's actually recorded the whole of all the waste they threw over the side, and also the contents are still there in the loch. And when it was excavated, they found that their diet included 200 different varieties of plant. That's a huge variety, and excavations of human poo in America have found that people sort of from a similar time, Bronze Age time, had maybe 30 or 40% more biodiversity in their gut than we do today. So that's what comes with this amazingly genetically rich diet. We can't replicate that, but you can do some things towards it. Okay, so a definition of health, and maximum freely available adaptive capacity, and you've got to have the basics. Not too many stressors for too long, along with strategies you can actually apply an adaptive space to do it. And I think maybe you can see, if you're thinking about actually doing this, where this might be a problem in our culture. And then full sensory engagement, calibration with the living environment, so that you're actually coming back from any overwhelm back to normality. Sense of home within the landscape, okay, and the cosmos. There's a lot of we as a culture, we've kind of lost the ability to deal with death, and this is a major issue. Death has become frightening, and so there's there's a lot of medical impetus to stopping death happening rather than promoting life. They're two quite different things. This embedded in a dependably supportive social group. Humans have become the most dangerous part of our environment. So it's gone from Stone Age, which was most of our evolutionary existence as humans, where we depended 100% on the people around us. You'd be with from maybe a handful of people, 4 or 5, small family group to 20, 30 people, and everyone would depend totally on everyone else. If you're a hunter-gatherer, then you have to have that reliability and dependence, because that is literally how you survive. And a valued member of that group. So there we go. We're back to Viktor Frankl there. So being able to have some positive input into the community that people value. Okay, and then this ability to step outside. So one of the things that happens with activation of the nervous system, so kind of trauma and whatever, is that the world gets narrower and narrower. We tend to get drawn in, and So, somebody can walk outside the door feeling really angry or depressed or whatever, and then all of a sudden there's this plant growing up between the cracks that they suddenly notice, or somebody smiles at them on the street, and then something changes. And what's happened is that their attention has been taken out from this little hole, and they've connected with something that's bigger, that has taken them out into a bigger world. So this is kind of all part of it. Okay, so what's gone wrong? I've already gone through a few little bits of this. What reduces this huge pool of resilience and adaptive capacity? And how does it end up that our nervous system that's evolved through this enormous span of history and all of these different things, how's it become overloaded? So basically, the modern world tends to make it that we accumulate stresses. We don't dissipate them. Once there's overwhelm, because of the various pressures and things that there are from our culture, then these stresses tend to accumulate rather than being dissipated as they should do. And what actually causes this? So I've kind of grouped together a whole load of. So here we go. These are all the different factors that there are. Because you see, overwhelm isn't just, again, people tend to think of trauma and they say, oh, it's to do with a bad experience. Well, if you redefine it into some kind of systemic overwhelm, then actually it can come from any direction. So what can stress your system? It can be a lack of support, or it can be or threat. And danger, but it can also be an infection, or it can be a lack of nutrition, or it can be being too cold or too hot or dehydrated. Okay, so your body uses the same resources to deal with all of these different stresses. So you can have, this is an example I use quite regularly, based on my experience when I was working in the mining industry. So you can have this young lad from Barnsley who has had an argument with the girlfriend, um, storms out of the house in the middle of winter just wearing a t-shirt, goes and gets drunk, and then staggers into the road and gets run over by a bus. Now, any 2 or 3 of those things, he might kind of come out the other side and be okay. But there's a certain point at which the accumulation of different stresses actually pushes the whole delicate balance of homeostasis beyond its capacity to deal with things elegantly. And then the body will go into some degree of overwhelm. So it doesn't have to be anything really, really bad, it's just there's an accumulation. So what that means is, if you've already accumulated stresses that have not been dissipated, then it's easier and easier to accumulate the next one. So then the tricky thing is, well, how do we deaccumulate? Because actually we're all kind of walking around with this stuff. The pervasive toxicity, really difficult to get away from. Let's go through that in a second. So generational early life imprints. Again, we've got a history of 2 world wars and a whole load of other stuff, and then there's a whole load of really quite birthing practices which do not suit our biology or our nervous system, and these all tend to create imprints, as do family members, families that we're born into, where the parents and the grandparents and so on themselves are affected by this. So there are various mechanisms by which all this gets passed on. The usual experiments on mice show that if you have a mouse that is very, very stressed, then when it gives birth, that level, the hormone balance in its body which comes about as a result of the stress, then informs the embryo as it's growing. And then the mouse, the young mice that come out, their whole metabolism is geared to come out into a dangerous environment. Good survival strategy. Now, that doesn't deprogram for half a dozen generations if everything's left to its own devices. Okay. So this is one way that things pass on generationally, but there are also just memories get passed on. It's really, when you look at this whole territory, it's quite extraordinary what comes out. Too much information that cannot be acted upon. So if you go where there are, where there's conflict, then there are people who've been in violent situations, and you kind of think they would be the ones who get traumatized, but actually quite often they recover. If people are able to act, if you are able to act, you physically move and actually go and help people or run away. So you've one way or another, your body has moved. Movement is life. So if you've been able to do that, then you tend to recover more often than not. If somebody's been an observer, so they've not been able to move, they've been stuck behind some kind of barrier or whatever, so they've just observed it, then they suffer what's called vicarious traumatization, which is okay, and they tend to have much more problems because they did not move. So there's this, so movement is fundamental. It's one fundamental part of your physical body recovering from some kind of shock or overwhelm. Disconnection from the earth, land, the living world. Yeah, how can you replace a relationship with the whole animal kingdom and the plant kingdom that you would have, again, if you were a hunter-gatherer with sort of animistic beliefs, with a relationship with just, say, one or two people or a handful of people. There's an enormous gap. And the landscape itself, we had relationships with the landscape. This is come out in a few places. Australian Aborigines, until ridiculously recent history, 1980s even, were removed from their families when they were children and by the government and taken to these schools to be made into somehow kind of pseudo white people. And I heard an Aborigine elder talking about this once on Radio 4, and he was saying that being taken away from his parents, in some ways, it wasn't that bad because he could feel their presence still there. He says what was really hard was being made to sleep in a building on a bed, because he said I was disconnected from the earth. I'd always been connected to the earth up to that point in my life, and that was taken away from me. Yeah, and this has been noted as well by Europeans who've gone off on long journeys and they've had to sleep on the earth, and they start to come back to civilization and find that they can't sleep in a bed. It just doesn't feel right. There's something missing when they're not under the stars. And so this is one of the big dissociations. This is one of the background dissociations that there is in our culture, which is utterly invisible, because unless you have experienced what it is, you have fully experienced that, yes, this is what it's like to be connected to the earth in that way, then you don't know what it feels. You don't know what's missing. This is the nature of dissociation. It's hard to know what's missing unless you experience what was missing. So if you go on meditation and you suddenly go, hey, all the colors are clearer. I mean, that happened to me once, and I was kind of going, wow, this must be some great spiritual experience. And it's only like 20, 30 years later, I realized, well, no, it was just that I didn't realize what was not switched on. Okay. We have a lot less room to adapt because of all of the, a lot of rules and regulations to keep a society together when it's very complex. And it just means it's harder to do what's necessary. If you go around rural India, then you can busk, you can cook a few little chapatis and sell them to people on the train passing through. In the UK, you need a license, and it gets all really complicated, and there's less room to move, so we're all kind of crammed together. And then there are all these strange ideas in our culture. One of them being, for instance, that relaxation is always good. That must be an endemic idea in the health professions. Relaxation's always good. You've got to be relaxed. Yeah, you've got to get that in the vagus nerve going. But when it comes to your body, if it's threatened, wants to move. It wants to expend energy, and if it can't expend energy in moving, then that is much less safe. So it's far more likely to go into overwhelm. So if somebody is feeling unsafe, actually one of the things that happens is they get tight areas of the body that are tight, and those areas are wanting to move. And those areas are the most resourced part of them. They're trying to fight to keep them alive. So we have all these kind of strange myths and customs. There's loads and loads of them which actually get in the way of recovery. And probably one of the biggest ones there, that blue circle on the right, is the lack of support that I described earlier, which you see in sort of traditional cultures, which has kind of gone missing. So there has to be some way. What could possibly go right? What can possibly go right? So in order for something to go right, it's necessary to focus on that. Now, again, there's this idea, one of the mistaken ideas is that in order to feel safe, you have to focus on safety. Now, people only focus on safety if they're feeling danger. If there is no danger, then the idea of focusing on safety is just totally meaningless. So if you're focusing on safety, where is the safety? It means you still feel you're in danger. It's the first stage of coming out, but it's not the final stage. It's just the beginning. And so, you look at that poem, and what Thich Nhat Hanh, I can never pronounce his name, is essentially pointing towards is the resource that is there. So when our attention goes to what is good, what is supportive, what is nourishing, what is beautiful, what brings out some response in us, I call it a glow. There's this beautiful kind of something wells up inside, which has a quiet joy to it. This sort of thing is actually taking us from the idea that we need safety. And I said, like the world starts to expand. So it's taking us into something bigger, which is then beyond whatever it was that wasn't right. Getting a lever on all of these, where do you start? I do my best to have a reasonable organic diet, so I avoid most of the chemicals. But what I've found with all of this stuff is if I'm frightened of something, then actually the fear is worse than the thing itself. So I keep a really close tally on that, and if I'm doing something because I'm frightened, actually I stop doing that reaction altogether, because the fear is really unhelpful, and that's what I need to get through. And then once I've got through that, then I can change my behavior in a way which is just very matter of fact, and going, what can I do in a reasonable, easy way that's not just going to add more stress. The main the main points that we have leverage are actually where we can seek more connection, but also this using the senses in a way where we are looking for what is right in the world, and that creates this just more sense of spaciousness. And then when there is this feeling in the body because something has responded, you can create some feedback with the body and by putting your attention on the response. And then this starts to grow. So a lot of that can actually become irrelevant, because most of it, when you transcend it by getting in contact with something which is not this small box of maybe danger or whatever, but something bigger, yeah, then a lot of this actually starts to dissolve. We again, as Thich Nhat Hanh pointed out, we carry around all of this resource and resilience inside ourselves. So the specific causes actually cease to be quite so important. Yes, and there are various techniques for looking at each of these. As I said, John, I'm going to be covering this in a lot more detail with some practicalities. Yeah, okay, in how this is done. But that needs a bit more time. Maybe people have got some questions on all of this. Yeah. Let's use the last 10 minutes or so and open the floor up a bit.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, lovely. Yes, please put any questions in the chat. That would be great. I like the fact that you referred to a slug as a higher evolved creature.
Well, yeah.
we have we have so many of them in
I'll
our
do this the slug impersonation. Yes. You got to be careful what you do. I used to do slug impersonations really well, and because there's a certain, there's buto, this Japanese dance form where
All right.
the thing that you dance. Okay,
Oh yeah.
so I did this buto workshop, and then I started really applying it, and I started doing slug impersonations, and I went on holiday with my girlfriend, and we stopped at this farmhouse, and there was a little family, and there were all these young kids, like 2 or 3 years old, and one of them had a book of little animals that you could sort of like cut out, and
Right.
so she gave each one of us an animal from this book, and I got the slug, and I realized at that point that actually I was doing it too well, and I'm copying it, so I kind of stopped.
Do you want to stop? Should we stop sharing? Do you want to stop sharing so we can see the bigger screen? Towards the beginning, you were talking about like percentages of people with PTSD and stuff.
Yes.
And it was very high, so 10 to 20% or something. Would you say there's a difference between men and women, not just in the terms of the levels of PTSD, but how that is processed, maybe, or not?
Yeah, I
Or
mean, this is this.
manifest?
Yeah, of course, there's differences, and however you put it, there are there are biological differences, um, and this is seen in the different. You can see it in the different incidence of different illnesses between the two sexes. If you go back to Robert Scare's work that says, if you look at it, then you could, okay, he doesn't say you can, he says you could explain all illness through this disruption of the physiology. Then you see different patterns of illness between men and women. Men tend to go more for the heart attacks, and women tend to have really more immunological issues, and what I see in my clinic is, generally speaking, men tend to have more issues to do with yeah, there's a really interesting axis between the spleen and the liver, isn't there? They're kind of like little. If you cut someone in half across the diaphragm, you're looking at a little yin and yang symbol, and the liver is a really anger, and there's about going out. You're using that fight flight and going out. So I see, a lot more men tend to have issues around the liver, and it's more about it's more this outward thing, and then a lot of women tend to have more issues around the spleen, and it's about it's not an exact divide. Let's put it a slightly different way. Some people tend to project more on the outside world and go, it's your fault, and some people project more internally and go, it's my fault. And you can split that up and go, more men tend to do it's your fault, and more women tend to do it's my fault, for sure. And this external versus internal blame thing and reactivity tends to create different patterns of illness. That's just one way that it works.
Yeah, I mean, I know from my experience in my early during my teens, being very, very dissociated and not, of course, not knowing that I was at all. But
that's right.
Really, the sense was of not having a body at all, and I didn't even know I didn't feel my body, and being very, very much in my head and feeling fine. But that's all I knew anyway, so it was fine. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
And you're still here.
I'm still here, yes.
You're still here, yes. Exactly. And until you experience something different, then you wouldn't know any different. You wouldn't know that it was possible to feel any different, because that was your experience of living.
It was really meditation that actually put me in touch with my body at all. And the experience was so powerful, I began to realize, yes, I did have a body.
Yeah, well, there we go. That's miraculous.
Yeah, it was actually, yeah. You mentioned you said about something being more only accessible when we slow down. Why do you think that's the case?
Well,
is this because you also mentioned about the need for movement? So what's the balance there between slowing down, feeling, and movement? And
there's different ways of thinking about this. But essentially, Ian McGilchrist has nailed a lot of this with his left, divided brain.
Oh yeah. Got that book, yeah.
And so if somebody is in a survival if somebody's in a survival state,
yeah,
then all they want to do is identify things as quickly as they can and manipulate the world so that they can survive better. So they tend to drop into left brain. And this is one of the feedback loops. Culture tends to take us into left brain because we live in this constructed environment. It's not a relational environment. There's just a set of bricks and a set of furniture and whatever that have all been put together that make a house and a room. So the environment we live in has very, very little relationality to it at all. So it's your left brain loves it, and so we tend to drop into this left brain state. But also the left brain is a survival state because it's about identifying things quickly. So you can go, that's safe, I can ignore it. Yeah, okay. So there's a lack of interest, and so things speed up. And there's much more sort of identifying things and then discarding them if they're not of immediate value or interest.
Yep.
Now, you drop into the right-hand brain, and you can only drop into the right brain if you're feeling safe enough to do so, because the right brain is about exploration. It's an extended curiosity, which is interested in the detail of things, not because anything might come of that necessarily, but because it's interesting. And it's the kind of curiosity that you see children have when they're playing. So play is a much more spacious kind of relationship with the world where nothing has to be in any particular way. There's more time. There's no need for anything to be anything other than it is, and it could be more than it is.
Yeah.
And you give it that spaciousness in both time and possibility, and then you find there's something new, because it's only in that way of perceiving that you can actually see that there's something different at what you're experiencing, which tells you, I've never come across this before.
Yeah.
And so that requires that there's this mental slowing down, and also there's this opening up. Something's bigger. And you can also think of it in terms of, being in a stack of boxes, as in, Kurt Gödel's if you have a set of equations, they can't possibly describe everything about themselves in a consistent way, which is kind of what life's about. Whereas so that's an individual. So you go to a therapist because that other person is able to see more, because they're not in your box.
Yeah.
And then somebody ceases to be a therapist when they get into rescuer, persecutor, whatever mode, or tries to overhelp, because they've entered your box. They're no longer outside. They've come into your box. So they're in the same small space, so they can't see anything bigger. So this thing about starting to expand out, so you see a bigger world, you're experiencing things from a bigger perspective, and it allows more in. That's going more into the right brain. And there is this, and poetry takes us into that, and there's love takes us into that. There are all kinds of entries into it, but it's an extremely important state to be in. And when you drop into that state, that's a really important feedback into the body, because then the body notices that particular quality of mental presence and attention, and it goes, well, if John is in that, he wouldn't be in that if he felt unsafe. That's how the message gets down. And that's the start of things beginning to reorganize themselves.
I like the way you talked earlier about safety and our relationship to safety, and how a lot of therapeutic processes seem to be concentrating on that.
Yeah.
For me, it's a bit like, you don't see it so much now. The whole thing about affirmations, people having things on their fridges.
Yeah.
Full of abundance, and it's sort of set up for the opposite, isn't it? It's like, well, you don't, if you really believe that, you wouldn't have it on your fridge, right?
Oh, I know. But I did, I had interesting experience with those. There was a guy in Norwich who went from being penniless in a squat to being a local millionaire, purely on the basis of using affirmations.
Oh,
so
nice.
I came across him, and I've actually met him, and interesting bloke. And I was kind of thinking, well, how did he do that? Because I had the same experience of affirmations that you did. I was kind of going, what on earth happened? And but I was kind of curious, so I happened to see this. I wouldn't have paid this amount. I wouldn't have paid the proper amount of money for this set of tapes. But there was a set of tapes of affirmations by Wilde. What's his name?
Stuart Wilde, no.
Can't remember his name. Anyway, this American sort of affirmation guru. So
Yeah.
I had them playing for a while, and at the same time, I was trying out heart math.
Oh yeah.
And eventually I put the two together, and I realized if I didn't feel what I was saying, I had to feel what I was saying,
Yes.
the affirmation to work.
Yes.
And if I didn't feel it, it wasn't in my body, then it was just me blind. It was just a word. It was an idea.
Yeah.
As soon as I felt it, then it had a reality. So so yeah, they do work, but it has to be felt. And then, there's once you realize that, there's all kinds of other ways, and you don't actually really need the affirmations as such when you get that, because then there's a whole load of entry points just somatically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. So
Uh,
we've got your course is coming up soon. And we'll be sending out details about that. I'm really looking forward to that. And you're going to go into this in more detail, aren't you?
yes, and make it more practical as well. There's been a lot of talking and theory here, and yeah, there needs to be some application that's simple, so it's usable and understandable.
Yeah,
So then it becomes a practical thing rather than just an idea. Yes.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you so much, Andrew. Lovely to see you again.
It's a
And
pleasure. Nice to meet you again, even though it's
yes,
a virtual meeting.
virtual meeting. Yes, and I think you're on again. Yes, and in a few weeks, so that'll be
Yeah.
wonderful. All right,
Okay,
great.
great. All
Thanks,
right.
Andrew, so much.
Thanks, John. Okay, brilliant.
Thanks, everybody. Bye bye.